Well, hello, here we are again, another Tuesday evening, another live stream, pre-show mode just for a moment or two. Nice to see everybody in the chat there, and Cookie just arrived. Another early start for CB, so not sure how long we'll be on for. Anyway, nice to see everybody here. And I've got Robbie teed up, ready to come in. For those not seen the show before, that's the studio. Robbie's over there, ready to come in a second. Everything else is working. I've got the controls for the show. I've got the multi-view, the chat, and everything else all working tonight, which is good. And of course, the dog is here as normal, looking pretty relaxed now. They've had their walks and food, and so hopefully they'll be quiet, although the bins are collected sometime. So we might get a bit of a bark at some point. We'll see. It's always a little bit of an interesting thing. Anyway, we're going to have a really interesting conversation this evening about all things to do with the current environment, both local, politically, internationally, and how it all interfaces back into Australia and Australians and all of those things and what we can do about it. Because, well, there's a few very important questions I think that we need to touch on. Anyway, that takes us up to the watershed at 8 p.m. So let me take the pre-show off. I'm going to start the show. I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening. Welcome to this live stream on the 17th of February, 2026. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to see you on this evening. Thanks for taking some time out of your Tuesday to spend it with us. Really appreciate it. Going to have an interesting, maybe a bit of a spicy conversation this evening with Robbie. And of course, there will be probably some quite high volume sections as we go through this. So I've made the appropriate adjustments on the audio settings. Before I bring him in, let me remind you that I don't provide specific legal or financial advice, general conversation only here. We moderate the chat, but feel free to throw your questions, comments, suggestions as we go. If you use that Walk the World DFA, that'll get into my queue. I've also enabled Super Chat, which means if you want to get your question to the top of the list, you can do that, or indeed make a contribution to what we do around here. Really appreciate all of those who support us via Super Chat, via Patreon, or via PayPal. It really makes a great difference and allows us to continue to do what we do. Don't do this for profit. We do this because we think there's a really, really important conversation to be had. All right, let me bring Robbie straight in. Hi, Robbie. Nice to see you again. How are you doing?
Good, Martin. Good to be back. The world's falling apart. The Liberal Party's falling apart. But you are a what do you call it? A certainty.
Well, so far the system's working all right, so fingers crossed. We did have a little hiccup on Twitter yesterday. I noticed it went down for a bit of time, but it's back now. But you make an interesting observation there. There's a lot of uncertainty out there in the world, but in a way, the issue around the Liberal Party is axiomatic of the broader issues, isn't it? I mean, it's amazing how a lot of the issues are sort of, we've got the rise now of a new neoliberal leadership team, which we'll probably touch on. It's worth reflecting, of course, that Albo's now been around for quite a long time. He's now, I think, only Howard, I think, has been in for longer, if you look in the modern era. You've got the RBA lifting interest rates rather than cutting rates further, and the financial pressures there. You've got all the issues with regard to control of what we can say and how we can say it, and the police state and all those things. And internationally, you've got, the China axis changing. You've got Mark Carney going over and saying hi to China and talking about the disruptive relationships and the old world order disappearing. All of those things are huge. And I guess, it's sort of noise in a way, but there's a lot of noise out there. And what I'd like to try and do this evening is navigate through some of this, but try and actually make it more tangible and talk about some of the things that we should be thinking about in terms of making sure that Australia is set up for future prosperity, not future disaster. Because at the moment, as I said in the title of the show, I think we're a bit of a potential inflection point, and the decision we take now, well, it's going to affect the next few years, isn't it?
Certainly, and I think the Liberals are emblematic of the big arc of history that's shaping what's happening. People tend to think in short-term cycles, and one of the things that the poor old Liberals are dealing with is they're trying to replicate the reasons for the success of the past, right? And so they can't get in their mind. John Howard looms large. Or let's do what John Howard did. And what they don't get, Martin, is that what John Howard did is sowed the seeds of their destruction now, because John Howard smashed manufacturing in Australia. John Howard continued the neoliberal financialisation of the Australian economy. John Howard created the housing bubble by policy, created the number one cancer in our economy, which has now created the defining political issue today, that the Liberals are scrambling to deal with. And so they think that it just doesn't make sense. Why can't we replicate that? Well, they can't replicate it because they're not looking at the fact that the economy is in terminal decline now, and it really now Angus Taylor said it, change or die, right? But they mean that in these silly little left-right terms or whatever, rather than change fundamentally their economic approach to the system. Understand the system has to be overhauled and completely addressed, or if they're not up to it, they will die. And that is the big issue for the whole world. The way I look at the world is so much of the tension in the world is caused by the economic reality. The regime is economic. The Western world is united by an economic regime, and that's one that has been, over the last 4 decades, neoliberalized and financialized, right? And just destroyed itself productively. And meanwhile, the non-Western world didn't go down that path. I could tell you they tried to get it to go down that path. The story of Russia in the 1990s was the Western world having got Russia, the defeat of the Soviet Union. They said, okay, we're going to force this onto Russia as well, the most brutal privatization program in history. And eventually the Russian people, after starving for a decade, said, get stuffed. Vladimir Putin came to power and put a stop to it. And people don't understand. That's why Vladimir Putin is a popular leader in Russia to this day. People have long memories. They remember the 1990s, where they followed Western economic policy, was hell on earth. China just focused on production, relentless production, perfecting production. There's a Chinese New Year is on now, right? Happy Year of the Horse, everybody. Ni hao, cookie boy. But I don't know I know people on social media, but they might come across this video of a Chinese celebration where the part of the performance was robots on the stage. And you can see the video of robots last year and robots this year in China. And the ones this year are so much more advanced in their movements, etc. The ones last year, it's just relentless production and improving the quality of what they do. You cannot, we saw that with the Japanese from the 60s to the 80s, right? It's, you can't make fun of Chinese quality anymore. It's the best in the world. They've made that leap. I mean, they cover the whole gamut of consumers, but nevertheless, they're capable of the best production in the world. They focused on the Belt and Road, which is all about investment in infrastructure, investment in trade infrastructure, investment in ports, investment in railways, investment in airports, etc. Right? And they were ridiculed for that, etc. But that's what they did, while the West allowed Wall Street to play with derivatives and London to play with derivatives, right? Just financial gambling with paper. And then when that wasn't crazy enough, they've gone crypto with it all, right? Even crazier gambling with tokens, with anyway. My point is, some people are going to react to me saying that, but it's just the contrast is the point. The contrast is this is an economic regime in the West that's failing. It's the same problem that's destroyed Australia, and it's behind so much that's causing our problems. And as it fails, what are our governments doing? They are resorting to outright fascism, totalitarianism, police state measures. We've just had the most shocking laws in our history rammed through Parliament in one day in January. Totally shocking. And now the Queensland government's trying to trump that by passing a law that can jail people literally for just saying words. 2 years jail just for saying words. Not incitement, not yelling fire in a public theatre, not incitement to kill anybody or commit a crime, which has always been words that have been illegal. Just saying words can jail. That's what they want to pass in Queensland. This is extraordinary. Free speech is dead, right? Why? Why are they resorting to this? Because the regime doesn't want to give up its power, because some people benefit from that power. The corporate interests in this country have never had it so good, as my grandfather used to quote Malcolm Fraser saying back in the day. You've never had it so good. Malcolm Fraser's life wasn't meant to be his. My grandfather used to say, my Pommy grandfather, grew up in London in the Blitz in World War II. You never had it so good, right? Well, the corporations definitely have never had it so good in this country. They don't want to give up their power. They own the two major parties, and the two major parties are going extinct, one faster than the other. And the first cab off the rank is the Liberal Party.
And look, a couple of observations there. The first is any chart looking at the relative wealth of ordinary people in Australia relative to the wealth of corporates shows that in the last 20 to 30 years, corporates have won and ordinary people have lost. And you can look at it in terms of, income. And I don't know whether you saw the RBA governor giving her evidence in front of the Senate, but it was really fascinating when they were squabbling about how to measure wage price, and Matt Canavan was really pushing and calling gaslighting, and she didn't like it. But the truth is, they have redefined how they measure wages growth. And they've done it recently. It's in the latest statement of monetary policy. And they're saying, no, we're going to do it this way rather than that way. But the truth is, everybody knows that ordinary people have gone really, really backwards in terms of the real effective amount of disposable income that they have. Taxes, of course, are a lot higher as well. And that's the other thing that that it wasn't covered.
But real wages, I think from the figures Matt Canavan was citing, is back to 2011 or 2009,
yeah, that's right.
Something like that.
Yeah, correct. So basically,
the biggest reversal in history.
Correct. And the point is that you can trend it back to around the global financial crisis. But since then, the wealth of corporates have gone absolutely astronomical. The wealth of the few percent have gone absolutely through the roof. It's partly because of that financial speculation and all of those things, and the things that we often talk about. But ordinary people aren't feeling the love, as it were. And so when it comes to, for example, the One Nation story, and of course we've got the situation now where the polls are putting One Nation ahead of some of the other parties, perhaps for the first time. And I often wonder whether, is it really a vote for something, or is it a vote against something, right? Because it seems to me that a lot of people are recognizing that the economic system that they're part of and running really hard to try and keep up with, and working multiple jobs and all those things, isn't working for them. And in a way, I suspect that many people have given up on the both sides of politics. Why? Because in fact, they're part of the same problem, right? They're locked into the same way of thinking about the future, which suggests that actually maybe it's more a vote against something rather than for something.
Well, I think it is, and because the rapid surge in the poll is the giveaway, right? Something has broken now. The Redbridge company that does polling, Costamaris, he made a point that I thought was quite interesting, because they poll for reasons for people voting, and he said it's the mothers in the outer suburbs who are the ones that are trying to pay the bills, right? Trying to pay their mortgage, and they've just had it to the back teeth, because nothing changes when the politicians promise them that everything will change, right? Nothing's changed. I mean, last time, Martin, an example of this, Martin, is last time, and maybe we should consider this, like this was definitely part of the mix, but last time you and I talked, we talked about the fact that the Labor government last year, before the election, in the year before, put on these rebates for electricity to get the price of electricity down temporarily, to get the inflation rate down, and buy the interest rate for cuts. And then as soon as the election's over, right? Oh, well, we're not going to do that anymore. So electricity snaps back. Well, people are paying that and they can't afford it. They can't, when those bills arrive, they cannot afford them. Right. And so there's this, and this is the new government. They didn't like the old government. That's why they voted it out. This is the new government that says we'll do this, and nothing happens. Right. So what do people do? It's like, and eventually it's like, okay, screw you all, a pox on both your houses. You know what happens in Romeo and Juliet? To what's the state of the guy who screams a pox on both your houses? He's just been shot in their bloody stupid war, right? He's about to die. He's a victim of their games, right? And he says a pox on both your houses, and this is what the public's saying: a pox on both your houses. And it's very similar to what, there's a really famous rant you can listen to. You got to dig it up, but Michael Moore, the filmmaker, the week before Donald Trump got elected in 2016, he was at a public meeting and he went on a rant explaining why Trump was going to win. No one believed Trump was going to win. Trump didn't believe Trump was going to win. I didn't believe Trump was going to win, though. I'd taken a bet on it by then. That I bet a slab of beer that he would by then, because I'd been having an ongoing debate with an American friend of mine. I kept winning, but anyway, Trump didn't believe it. It was such a long shot. Michael Moore said, "What's happening here is the people, these former workers in the industrial heartland of America, the Rust Belt, who no longer have jobs, who don't have health care, who can't afford, paying just headache tablets or whatever, right? They're sending a wrecking ball into Washington." He put it something like that, right? So they're sending a wrecking ball into Washington. And Cos Samaras and the Red Bridge poll people say that the motivation of these voters in Australia is something similar to that. And that's because the system has broken. And we can attest to that, because we have tried as hard as you possibly can. Nobody has tried harder than the Citizens Party, in collaboration with you and our other collaborators, to try and get the processes of government to address real problems. Right? The problems are real. The solutions are there. Okay, implement them. And we keep coming up against these brick walls. And we know the system pretty well. But the average person, they hate politics. They don't want to be part of it. And it's like, okay, you hate Pauline Hanson. Well, I hate you. I'm going to vote for her. Right? But my concern, and we work with all the parties. We try and work with them, and I have a good working relationship with Malcolm Roberts, is this is an opportunity now that we haven't seen before. It's the shift has been rather rapid. It's got to be confirmed in actual votes, like the Farrer by-election, the South Australian vote, etc. The shift has been rather rapid. The public need to make sure that they get in there. I'm not saying join One Nation or vote for them, but what I'm saying is they are now going to be getting more votes. Do your best to help shape them electorally, because there's big, powerful interests that are moving in to help shape them, I can tell you, right? Gina Rinehart's putting she's the wealthiest woman in Australia. She's putting her clout behind them. Big money managers are starting to donate to One Nation. I don't like those signs, I can tell you. Absolutely. I think that's not a good trend. And they are going to want to have influence with that backing, right? They are not the losers in society. They are the 0.001%. The public, there's a side of the members of One Nation, they want to actually serve the public. You get in there and make sure that you demand that they do serve you, right? That we need to treat them like one of the big parties and demand that they serve the people now, support the policies now that are going to make a change. And what the Citizens Party tries to do is enunciate and campaign for those specific policies that can make a change. We've already got agreement with One Nation on policies like the postal bank. I desperately hope they follow through on that. But in general, right, understand that big financial interests are going to be moving in to try and influence, because they don't really care which party's in power. They just want to make sure they influence it. And how do they influence? With money. Right? The public needs to understand that. You think, well, we don't have something to combat that. No, you do. Percy Shelley talked about it in his famous poem, The Mask of Anarchy, in the early 1800s. Right? Ye are many, they are few. Right? Numbers, people power. Right? You treat One Nation treat this new electoral force and say, okay, what are you going to do? You make sure you serve the people.
Yeah, well, we might come on towards the end of the show and perhaps go through some of those policies in more specific detail, Robert, because there's quite a few people in the chat asking about, so what are the policies? What are those levers? But just before we get there, I just want to come back to the Liberals and a bit, and the Four Corners show that was put out yesterday, because for me that was a really interesting, again, microcosm what's going on. And I thought they did a pretty good job of highlighting the different factions or the different alignments that are potentially possible. So they talked about the people who are more aligned to the Trump view of the world, which is a popularist, close down immigration, do that sort of stuff. We have the neoliberal guys who are sort of currently sitting now trying to work out what to do. And there are a few other people with different views too. And to me, it highlighted that there are lots of different angles here, different groups with different opinions about what the problem is and how to solve it. And in a way, that in its way of thinking, to my mind, is a microcosm of what we're seeing more broadly, because there are people saying, oh, Trump's right. The idea of getting rid of migrants and shutting down migration, and doing all of that stuff is the way to solve the problem, and be very strong militarily and drive that sort of. There are other people wanting to recast again what the Howard era did, which was effectively pump more money through. Well, they were fortunate, I would argue, rather than actually through policy, pump money through the system. But that didn't help because, of course, it all went back to the big corporates. And, if you look at the lending trends, well, that's all because of the mortgage stuff, because house prices are so high relative to incomes. The banks love that, and they're the winners there. And if you think about some of the other angles of attack here, specifically with regard to, Australia, well, what's your relationship with the US? We got the AUKUS thing, spending even more money, another $30 billion on another investment down in Adelaide, etc. That's 3 times the Housing Future Fund. I'd highlight. There's a real question here about what these ideological positions are doing and how it translates into different policy manifestations, because that's the point, isn't it? One, you have to be elected and be in power to make a difference, really. And 2, you've got policies, but the question is who benefits from those policies and who don't. And if I think about where things are now, money buys influence, buys political power, buys the ability to set the agenda. And I would argue that some of the things that we've seen in Australia the last 20, 30 years is that process very much being made manifest.
Oh, it absolutely is. Because when you... they essentially dismantled government. They downsized government, and they told us that was their goal, right? You don't want big government. What they meant by big government, I've now come to understand, is not the things that people get annoyed because you get taxed so much. Because often the people who rant the most about big government, they end up being big government anyway. But because they'll do big government military. Right, they'll no end of money for those kinds of things, but what they meant was governments that build infrastructure, governments that deliver services. Right, they privatize those functions, Martin, and in doing so, they created a rentier class that was already there, but they made it much bigger. Right, and then those interests realized, well, we can keep this going by owning who's in government. Buy off the 2 major parties, right? The big banks are big donors. The big gas companies are big donors. The big miners are big donors. The big 4 accounting firms are some of the biggest donors, right? And and by big donors, they're big relative to what the major parties get in donations. But the donations they give the major parties are tiny compared to the profits they make because of what the major parties do for them. So in other words, the major parties are cheap whores, and this lasted fine. This lasted a long time until we reached the bottom of the barrel, right? Because they dismantled our system. They took away our capacity to be able to look after ourselves. And now what you have is a situation where, I mean, at least when governments used to own their own assets, they would often have services that were self-funding. By getting rid of all that and doing it for profit, right? There's not even any kind of revenue back to the government for providing those services. So the money the government has to dole out is going on debt, right? And the debt is paid for with our taxes, and the taxes have to go up, right? And while our taxes are going up, what about the taxes of the big corporates? So you might have seen this, that David Pocock pointed out in Senate estimates that Australians pay more in beer tax than the gas companies pay for their profits on gas. And I just saw one of the coalition politicians today hit back at that and say, because she included the royalties in the taxes that the gas companies pay, right? And she tried to claim it was much bigger, and someone replied, well, okay, let's include the income taxes that the beer drink. If we're going to include the royalties that the gas companies pay, let's include the income taxes that the beer drinkers pay, right? Which was much, much bigger than the royalties of the gas companies. Because what is a royalty? It's you buying the right to use the public's minerals. That's what a royalty is. It's not a tax, right? But they scam the public because they get off scot-free. They've rigged the tax system. All these big corporates have rigged the tax system for themselves, and so the burden always falls on the households, right? And this is, remember that principle of bail-in when what's his name at the Bank of England said years ago, there is only households, right? We are the mugs that have got that carry the burden on our backs. And yeah, it's broken. Now the Liberal Party, or the Coalition, actually, Four Corners last night was quite revealing on this. The Coalition is being torn apart by some real tensions here. And temporarily, at least, the neoliberal faction has prevailed. Angus Taylor proudly declared himself a free marketer and all that kind of stuff. Jane Hume, oh my God, Jane Hume as the deputy leader, we call her the senator for bankers, and she earned that title. I don't deny Jane Hume's work ethic. She works really hard for bankers, right? That's why we called her that. We ran into Jane Hume in 2018 when we tried to stop bail-in, and she chaired the Senate inquiry that had to look at bail-in, and she rigged the damn thing. And then we put up a bill in 2019 for Glass-Steagall. Actually, Pauline Hanson introduced our bill, right? The Citizens Party wrote the bill. Pauline Hanson, Bob Catter had introduced it in the House, 6 months earlier, and it just sat there and didn't go anywhere. So Pauline Hanson introduced it in the Senate just before the 2019 election. You remember that? And that led to a Senate inquiry into Glass-Steagall, which is the principle of breaking up the banks, separate commercial banks with deposits from all the other businesses that vertically integrated banks got into. And Jane Hume rigged that inquiry. Jane Hume used to work at NAB. She used to work at Rothschilds Australia. She used to work at Deutsche Bank. And she has the finest banking pedigree of any member of parliament outside of Josh Frydenberg, probably, when he was there. But, David Littleproud's a banker. Kevin Hogan's a banker. There's a whole bunch of these bankers on the coalition side. And so she's now in charge of, or second in charge of the Liberal Party. She's the leader of the Liberal Party in the Senate. And all she's going to do is push the neoliberal agenda, which will continue to benefit the banks. There's no point even hiding this story anymore. When the first time I ever met John Alexander, when he was still a member of Parliament, the tennis ace, John Alexander was Liberal member of Parliament for a while. Because he wasn't a career politician, John Alexander, he thought he was in Parliament to try and make a difference. So he chaired an inquiry in 2018 or 2017 into housing affordability, and it made recommendations that upset the banks. And Jane Hume ripped into him. Jane Hume said to John Alexander, you have, what did she say? You are not qualified to have your opinions. Right? That's what she said to him. And she's now the leader of Liberal Party. And I think you saw how it works just the other day when after they got their leadership and they did their first outing together, Taylor and Hume. Taylor said, oh, it's all about housing. Young people can't afford housing. It's the worst thing ever. And then straight away, literally in the next breath, he ruled out any changes to the capital gains tax discount. Yet the capital gains tax, the New South Wales Treasury has recently made a submission to the federal parliament that echoes what the Productivity Commission said to John Howard back in 2004. The capital gains tax discount, more than anything else, has advantaged investors over first home buyers. Now, there's all sorts of ways you could change the capital gains discount. There's a pretty painless way to change it. I understand plenty of people have their investments and they made their investments on the basis of their discount. All right. Well, what we're trying to do here is stop the distortion of the housing market. So just end the discount going forward. Don't take it away from any existing investors at all, right? And even just end it for real estate. It hasn't distorted the stock market. Just end it for real estate and only going forward, right? So no, it doesn't harm any current investors at all, right? Nothing changes for them. It just means that going from now on, any new investors will know they have to pay the full capital gains tax, and that means that first home buyers are no longer disadvantaged against those investors. That's what will change. But there's one group it will affect, Martin, because there's no change to the capital gains discount that won't affect this one group, and that's the banks.
Yep.
Right? Because they're the ones who lend against it. They're the ones who go out. Look, people, first home buyers go into banks to say, can I borrow? And the bank says, no, we're not going to lend you money to buy a house to live in, but we will lend you money to become an investor, because they factor in the capital gains discount to that decision, right? And so you can't live in the house. You still got to live with mum and dad, but you can have an investment property. The banks, this has been a gravy train for the banks. They're the most profitable banks in the world. They invest more. They lend more for real estate than any other banks in the world. This is the biggest part of their lending. They will scream blue murder if it's taken away from them. So it doesn't matter it's had such a distorting effect on the housing market, right? It doesn't matter you could do it in a painless way for all the consumers. No, the banks will not hear it. And so Hume and Taylor, bang, ruled it out cold. That's just, to me, illustrated the banks are in charge. So that's the current state of play in the Liberal Party. The question is, what's going to happen with this faction that Four Corners highlighted that is obviously clearly seeing the writing on the wall. Matt Canavan's one of them in the coalition, right? And we got to work with Matt on the branch closures inquiry. They're clearly seeing the writing on the wall, and they're saying this cannot continue. They're the same ones in the party. Will they prevail?
Good question. And, it is worth us highlighting just how powerfully connected the banks are and how much they spend lobbying and influencing and all of those things. And there have been, the BEAR regulatory framework, right, which is effectively the one that was proposed to be put in post the inquiry into the behaviour of the banks to try and actually control perhaps some of the excesses of the banking system, and how that was actually derailed again through the back door.
Well, in the end, the other way with the banks, because they've rigged it with those sorts of things like donations, etc. But it's also the revolving door, right? And it's not just the banks, but the banks are at the front of the revolving door. There was an exchange last week in Senate estimates about the military. I don't know if you saw this, David Shoebridge, and it was the most shocking part of the exchange is how quick it was. General King, I don't know anything about him. His name's General King, Australian Defence Force. His job up until January in the Australian Defence Force was he oversaw the contract that was awarded to Lockheed Martin. He quit the Australian military, the ADF, in January. And David Shoebridge said to the Defence Force chiefs at Senate estimates, they said, where is General King working now? In February. And straight away they answered, Lockheed Martin. I mean, it is that the biggest defence, probably second biggest, I think, after Boeing. It is that shameless. Well, the banks do it as well. Where's Josh Frydenberg now, the former Treasurer of Australia? Right? Which one is it? JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, one of those. Christopher Pyne. Christopher Pyne got a platform 2 weeks ago at the National Press Club so he could comment on the Liberal Party's misfortunes and bring the wisdom of Christopher Pyne back, the fixer. Well, has it occurred to any of these stupid journalists who decide to invite a scumbag like this back that he contributed to the problem when he left the government as the Minister for Defence and walked straight into a job in the defence industry sector, making money from defence, right? The public heard that. It just added to their absolute disgust with all the politicians that they think are all overpaid, right, and absolutely bloody useless and all on the take. And guess what? They're not all on the take. I can assure you they're not all on the take, but bloody a lot of them are, right? A lot of them actually are. I mean, let me go after someone now that I seldom would go after. In fact, probably the last time I mentioned her on your show, Martin, I probably would have praised her. And the only reason I would have praised her is because Sarah Hanson-Young chaired the Christine Holgate inquiry in 2001, remember? And she did a relatively good job. But Sarah Hanson-Young used her parliamentary allowance to shuttle her husband from Adelaide to Canberra. But what was his job? His job was in Canberra as a lobbyist of the federal government. That was his job. So she was using the taxpayer money to get him to his job. Now that's bad enough. I was also disgusted at who he works with. This guy is now a consultant. He used to be at the Australia Institute. He's now a consultant in exactly the same firm as two of Scott Morrison's henchmen, David Gazzard and Scott Briggs. Now, Scott Briggs is the guy that was doing the text messages with Mike Pizzullo, two public servants deciding who was going to be cabinet ministers in the Australian government. And when those text messages came out, Mike Pizzullo had to resign in disgrace, as he should have, right? A public servant is not, we pick the government, not these overpaid public servants. Mike Pizzullo is one of the most sinister people in the history of Australian politics, and he's been rehabilitated by the media in real time to be the commentator on every bloody thing, including Four Corners a week ago about the ASIO failings that led to Bondi. Two henchmen of Scott Morrison, what do they have to do with a Green? Why is a Green, Ben Oquist, who used to be an advisor to Bob Brown and is the husband of Sarah Hanson-Young and is a lefty on the left side of politics, right, supposedly, why is he in bed in a consultancy with two henchmen, right, of a thug like Scott Morrison? It's what's his name? George Carlin said, it's a great big club and you're not in it, right? And these are the Greens that are supposed to, sometimes the Greens do some really good job. David Shoebridge can do excellent grilling like nobody else in Parliament, and I cheer him on every time. Nick McKim goes after the RBA like nobody else does. But as an institution, they're infected as well. This is the stuff that just makes the Australian public sick to death of politics. Right. And so they say, okay, well, let's burn down the house. And what we're saying is, no, you got to let's actually start thinking what we can do to change things here. We need to think positively. We need to have really constructive policies that can make a difference. That's what the Citizens Party works very hard to formulate and express and campaign for. And don't just get swept away with the narrative of the day. Right. So right now, the narrative of the day is because of the housing crisis, immigration's the problem. One nation's going to be the toughest on immigration, and the Liberals are now going to, have said, okay, immigration's our number one problem as well. Right. And then because they have to outdo each other, Pauline comes out and says something. Sorry, it was disgusting what she said today. Right. What are good Muslims? Well, one of them just bloody saved people's lives in Bondi, Pauline, you dumb idiot. And I hate to speak like that because I try and work with people in her party, but it was disgusting and it was unacceptable. There's 1 million people in Australia that do not deserve to be maligned by this kind of backward idiocy that comes from who benefits from this kind of stuff. The big people. It's not. One of the principles I work on, Martin, is that I will, There's no such thing as perfectly objective knowledge. No such thing. Maybe in the world of the hardest of hard physics there is, but everything else has different degrees of subjectivity, as you know, Mr. Philosopher. Right?
Absolutely. It's
We're
all
all
relative.
influenced by our outlook. And you choose something. You choose your philosophy. And part of my philosophy is I will never accept that my fellow human being is the cause of my problems. Ever. I choose not to accept that my fellow human being is the cause of my problems, right? And there's obviously when you get a million when governments go crazy and say, okay, we're going to, the only way we can keep the economy propped up is we'll just flood us with more people. That's called a Ponzi scheme. Obviously, that's no good, but that's not the fault of the people who are coming in. That's the system that's trying to save itself. And what's happened now is what started off as a pretty seemingly measured discussion about, hang on, there's a bit too much. The governments are relying a bit too much on immigration to prop up their economy, has already degenerated thanks to the National Socialist Network and the March for Australia people that are quasi Nazis as well, Nazi adjacent, half of them, etc. Thanks to the people who want you to be blaming your neighbor, your fellow man for your problems, right? Instead of the system, right? It's already become very racialized in Australia. And we reject that entirely. The problem is the system. Identify what is wrong with the system. And the people who are trying to tell you not to do that are the charlatans who are trying to protect the system. Right. And that's, to me, that's the way to tell who's genuine or who's not. Now, some people, maybe some comments can be excused as just dumb ignorance. But otherwise, there's a whole machinery here that's geared to keep people distracted, right? So they don't go after the system. And what we're saying is we need to go after the system. Years ago, Martin, I declared on your show that neoliberalism was dead. And it is dead. But what you got is people, the apparatchiks and the parties are clinging to it. That's why we just described what's happened in the Liberal Party. But the Liberal Party is also the party that produced Jared Rennick. Jared Rennick, for the 6 years he was a senator, was the loudest advocate in Parliament of the policy that was the defining policy of the old Labor Party, a national bank. Right? Jared Rennick could see it. You need a national bank that you can come back and actually start investing in the things that support the economy. You've just had Albanese and Malinowskis team up together twice in Adelaide the other day to announce $30 billion for whatever to do with AUKUS, whatever construction to do with AUKUS, which is $30 billion for nothing because we're not going to get AUKUS, right? But $30 billion, just think about that. Yet 2 weeks earlier, they were together in Adelaide to announce something like $300 million for public housing. No, for housing for her first home buyers in the form of some pathetic little loans to help for some developers to build some necessary specific infrastructure for the developments. That's their priorities, right? We need to reverse that. You put the investment into the things that it's going to make our lives better. And we're the Citizens Party this week, tomorrow, will be publishing a very good article written by my wife, Elisa, about what we can do now based on what we did in history to make housing better now. But it involves investment, a lot of investment, but replicate things like, ironically, the very best model of public housing in Australia was the South Australian Housing Trust under a Liberal Premier for 30 years, Sir Thomas Playford. And he made, by his attitude was, we're going to invest in housing. We're going to make the standard of living of the people of South Australia so good that now the unions used to, this was a Liberal logic. The unions used to criticize him for this, but I can understand the logic because I'm not ideological about it. He made their standard of living so good that the workers didn't demand pay rises every 5 minutes because they weren't falling behind. And then in turn, that made them competitive for the things like the car industry, of which South Australia was a center of the car industry, right? But it all started with someone being prepared to invest in its people. And today, these idiotic neoliberals would call that communism, except there was a Liberal who did it. right? And the Prime Minister of Australia at the time was another Liberal, Robert Menzies. So unless we start looking at these things and say, okay, what do we do to go back to making sure the system works for everybody? Get rid of the ideology of we don't want government or little government, big government. No. Real government, effective government. You're going to have government. Fight to make it effective, right? And understand that government will always have a role. Make it the best it can be. And its role is, in short, investing in infrastructure and delivering services. That is the role of government. Don't let these charlatans get away with not going back to that role and blaming your neighbour instead.
And it's just on that. Elizabeth, of course, is the area of Adelaide that was the epicenter of its prosperity and growth for a very significant number of years. But also, it is now one of the most deprived areas in and around Adelaide, right? The reason is that the industrial base that effectively supported and was enabled by that government investment was hollowed out. And there's a very important connection point between making stuff and doing stuff locally and making sure that people have good jobs that actually pay well enough to be able to actually make the model work. And the concern I have at the moment is, Robbie, that we still have the situation where, because, of course, very high power prices in particular, manufacturing in Australia has gone nowhere. It's gone into reverse, and we are more and more reliant now on those international trade links with whoever to be able to actually try and keep our standard of living up. But in the process, we end up then with disabling effectively that economic flywheel that was created under the Elizabeth Plan.
Yeah, Martin, you're talking to a party that's always advocated protectionism and tariffs, right? Because that was the economic history of Australia. But you've got to deal with what you've got in front of you, not what you wish. And so, what we would say is, right now, the worst possible thing to do is what Donald Trump has done with tariffs, right? Because they haven't had the benefit that he claims. Like his economic performance in the poll is when people judge him for the economy in the polls, it's abysmal. It's been very, very disruptive. He actually he's influenced by an understanding of tariffs that actually our organization had an association with an American movement led by an economist named Lyndon LaRouche, and they did a lot of work on reviving the history of Hamiltonian economics, and in the early 19th century, this big fight between these American economists who wanted to develop America, and they're up against the people in the South who wanted to maintain a slave economy and just be raw materials providers to English textile manufacturers. And they were the advocates of free trade, right? And so the two in the first half of the 19th century, the fight was between what they called the American system and the British system. The British system was free trade. It was the East India Company model. And the American system, no, we want tariffs. We want to protect our industries. And so we've done all the work on that. And you can see the role of tariffs. And in fact, at Davos, very interestingly, at Davos, you can look it up. The Trump's trade negotiator, and I'm having a mental blank on his name, is a fairly young guy, trade negotiator, gave an excellent speech on Alexander Hamilton and American system economics. And the speech was great. The Q&A was terrible because he tried to say what Trump is doing is that, and it's not, right? Trump is doing punitive tariffs, and it's just crazy. It's been a massive disruption. What we need to do in Australia, though, is bring back our manufacturing. So, how do you do it? Well, there's more than one way to skin a cat. The first ingredient is investment. Have a national development bank that can provide inexpensive credit, right, for a line of credit for entrepreneurs who want to manufacture something. And if you can back them with an inexpensive line of credit, and we used to have these mechanisms in Australia, right? The Commonwealth Development Bank went from 1959 until 1996, and you back these guys, and so you come up with structures to these loans, or sometimes they're not even loans. You're taking out equity, but Albanese is trying to do a little bit on the side with his National Reconstruction Fund, but it's a set $15 billion fund. That's it. We need $500 billion. right, invested in this kind of available for what's being lent into the housing market every year. Let's start matching that for actually bringing back manufacturing in Australia, right? Much more than a piddly $15 billion. But you can do that. And then also, don't try, if you just whack up tariffs, you're going to start making everything expensive that's coming in. Pick strategic industries to start with and bring back. One thing I've learned from China, because you cannot doubt China's economic success with manufacturing, is it turns out that they have this system where, and it sort of dawned on me after a while, because people, you'd be talking to Chinese people about different cities, and they would say, oh yeah, that city makes this, not that company, that city, or that other city makes that. Right? There's a whole city that's known for making fireworks. There's a whole city that's known for making electric cars or whatever, right? What do? That's actually, it's a system they have where the city concentrates on it. You get all these different manufacturers of one type of product in the same city, and they're all learning off each other as they go. One innovates and it's quickly copied by everybody else, right? And it keeps the costs really low, the rate of innovation really, really rapid, right? The government supports it with the Chinese government has these big development banks like we used to have. I'm not saying Australia should become communist like China. I'm saying Australia should go back to what it used to do that the Chinese copied. We're one of the countries they copied. Japan is one of the countries they copied, right? We gave it up. Let's go back to doing that. Bring back our manufacturing and then let's manufacture things that are going to be good for us. Like the $30 billion that Albo and Malinauskas announced in South Australia is for war. There's no lack of money for war. When are we going to do something positive, right? We could be building high-speed rail around Australia and use our own steel, right? And improve the lives of Australians everywhere with high-speed rail. There's projects that have been talked about since the 1980s that were absolutely viable, and no one ever did it. Meanwhile, China didn't complete its first high-speed rail line until 2008, and already it's got 50,000 kilometres using our iron ore. Yet we don't use a skerrick of it for the same thing. That's the sort of stuff we should be doing, not spending $300 billion on stupid submarines that we're not going to get. Electricity, we need to renationalise the electricity utilities. I don't really care about the power plants. What I would propose is the government needs to work with the states to say, take them back in public hands, so that if you do have a privately owned power plant or a privately owned solar farm, fine, but you sell that power to the government and the government will sell it to the people and keep the damn price low, because that's the other way you can bring our competitive advantage back. Keep the price low. And, this is how we developed an electricity system in this country. We weren't like the Americans. We had an entirely public electricity system. We need to bring it back in each state, back under state control. Queensland still has state electricity. That's why they were the easiest at being able to drop the price of their electricity system. But then you've got to get rid of stupid policies like national competition policy that say state-owned enterprises are not allowed to outcompete private businesses, right? So the Queensland's electricity power stations are on the same national electricity market as the private ones in New South Wales and Victoria, etc., right, and South Australia. They could outcompete us like that because they don't need to make a big profit, but they're not allowed to, so they have to charge the same amount as the other states and rip off the Queensland taxpayer that owns them by as much as we get ripped off by the private ones. That's called national competition policy, right? In other words, we passed a policy 30 years ago to rig the system in favour of the private predators and parasites who came and bought our previously public infrastructure. Scrap it all. This is what Four Corners tried to show. There was a little glimmer where people are saying this hasn't worked. We've got to get rid of it. And instead, the Liberal Party, like I said, Martin, in something I just wrote, if this was the Titanic, the Liberal Party would be the ones running back down into the hold, right, where the water's flooding in, while everyone else is jumping off board because no, we're clinging to this privatized, we're clinging to this neoliberal thing, mate. This is the only thing we know, right? We're going to go down with this ship because that's the only thing we know. Whereas someone's got to cut through and say, no, this has got to go. Now, I don't think One Nation has developed policies like this. But tell them they should. If you have any access to One Nation, tell them they should, because now's the time, with this rapid shift in the polls, that we can get a proper debate on these things, which previously the two major parties made sure were never debated. One, I did agree with Barnaby Joyce on Four Corners, because he nailed something really, really important, where he said this idea of the parties of government is a pile of bullshit. These two, the worst these two major parties, Martin, have gone down the gurgler over the last few decades, where their primary vote has gone down and down and down. And now, of course, with the Liberals, it's in free fall. The worse it's happened, the more they have banded together and used this term, we are the parties of government, as in some power up there has ordained us, not the democracy of the people of Australia. We have been ordained that we will rule you. Well, we know what that power is. That's the power of corporate money has ordained them, right? And by saying we are the parties of government, they're saying that's who we serve. Well, the public is saying right now in the polls, oh, really? Get stuffed, right? And that change was high time. But we're going to make sure we replace it with something that actually works. So we've got to think through these policies and say, okay, this is what we used to do. We should go back to everything that we used to do and say, did it work? Why did we change it? And if it did work and there wasn't a good reason to change it, go back to what worked.
Yeah, and just on that, the energy story is quite interesting, because, of course, we know that the marginal price of electricity is driven off the price of gas. We know that the price of gas is driven by the international markets because of the way that those international conglomerates work, and that the regulatory framework is broken in Australia. We also know that the price of electricity is actually also, because of the mechanism they use, you start really cheap and you go up. And then there's a point where you actually, okay, I've now got enough. At that point, everybody is effectively paying that higher price rather than actually the way it should be, because it should be that the more efficient and low price is the one we use. So there's masses of issues there. And then the other thing, Robbie, over the top, you talk about corporates and what they're doing. The AI revolution and the data center revolution is now another overlay on this, because, of course, data centers need power, and they can afford to pay a lot more than ordinary people to be able to get that power. And they need water, and guess what? We don't have a lot of water in some parts of Australia either. So we are repeating the same mistakes again and again and again, rather than actually standing back and saying strategically, what is right for the future of the country? And the thing I get frustrated about in all of this is that you see tactical political decisions being taken all the time against that ideological backcloth that we've spoken about, which is neoliberal led. So corporate's good, private sector's good, public sector bad. We don't want to invest too much, all that sort of stuff. Truth is that actually that is not serving the interests of ordinary Australians. It's actually making ordinary Australians' life more expensive, more difficult, and the cost of everything continues to rise. It's because of the ideological framework that's been driving decisions for generations. Oh, and by the way, just to say that the MMT school of motoring, which says, well, okay, what we'll do is we'll just spend a lot more on government stuff. Sure, but you've got to spend it on the right stuff. You've got to spend it on the right investments. It's not just the quantum of the spend, it's the quality of the spend and what you invested in. And the problem we've had over the last 20, 30, 40 years is the lack of investment in the fundamental infrastructure and systems and processes to support the economy. And if you go back several generations prior, Australia was renowned for having this strategic architecture and this strategic approach for investment, public bank and all. It was about laying the foundations to build a society, not now, as it is, maximizing the profit of corporates.
Well, my message to Angus Taylor is go back and look at what your grandfather represented, who he cited the other day. Now, Angus Taylor's grandfather was, what's his Hudson. He's sorry, I'm mental block. I'm an old man now. The man who was the head of the Snowy Mountains Authority and built the Snowy Mountains camp was Angus Taylor's grandfather. And Angus Taylor only raised him because he was asked about building more dams, and he said, "Oh well, my grandfather built the Snowy Mountains scheme." It was Well, his grandfather was a bloody legend, right? That's one of the most incredible engineering schemes in the world. The founding chairman of the Citizens Party, when he got married in the 1950s in central Queensland, took his new bride down to New South Wales to see the Snowy Mountain scheme under construction. Right, it was such an exciting thing for this country to build this project. We embarked on that scheme. William Hudson, thanks, Doug. I got my backup team there. Thanks, Doug Mitchell. Doug's the discoverer of bail-in. Remember, Martin? Doug's the guy who in 2017 should have been working harder at his desk, but he was looking at what was going on in Parliament one August afternoon. And just saw a bill and thought the title of the bill was suspicious, and he forwarded it to me, and it was right. It was the bill that had the loophole for the bail-in of deposits. Anyway, thanks very much, Doug. So William Hudson, we embarked on the Snowy Mountain scheme in 1949 at a time when Australia had the most ever national debt. 140 something% of GDP was our national debt in 1949, right on the tail end of World War II. Enormous. And we embarked on a scheme that was projected to cost 15% of GDP at the time. By far the most expensive project in Australian history. 15% of GDP was the cost of that scheme. We built it on time, on budget. 25 years it was projected, $800 million, and that's what it cost. But by the time we finished it, 25 years later, our national debt had shrunk to a tiny percent of GDP, not because we'd paid it all off by any means, but because that investment in the Snowy Mountain scheme had driven the economic growth of Australia in those decades. And our economy had grown enormously, right? And it was all productive. Our manufacturing peaked at over 30% in about 1966, 67. And manufacturing peaked at about 30%. We were a productive powerhouse in Australia, right? We learned all the things that we learned to do in World War II. We kept doing them. There was one point where we had 7 car brands in Australia, manufactured in Australia. Tiny market, 7 companies manufactured here. All the rules, all the market rules that people assume today, we just defied them all. Back in those days, right? Incredibly productive economy. But it was underpinned by a government commitment to have a productive economy that was committed to building the infrastructure and investing in the industries using public institutions like a national bank. And that's what we got rid of. That's what we dismantled. Charlatans came along in the 1970s, right? And they wrote Margaret Thatcher's script for her and Ronald Reagan's script for her and Roger Douglas's script in New Zealand and Hawke and Keating's script here. They tried to get at Malcolm Fraser before Hawke and Keating, but Malcolm Fraser was a bit old school, and I got to know Malcolm in his final years and talked to him somewhat about this. He was I mean, it was all the rage at the time, so he was sort of swept up a little bit by it. But there was so much that he just thought, no, we need Malcolm. Malcolm was someone who thought Australia should be a big country. We could have a bigger population, right? I mean, the Citizens Party has always believed that. But what we mean is only if we invest in the future. Dr. J.J.C. Bradfield, one of the genius engineers of world history who built the Sydney Harbour Bridge, not just the Sydney Harbour Bridge, he built those subways under Sydney. Right, Dr. Bradfield did. He wrote in the 1930s that he projected Australia would have 40 million people, 40 million, by 1990. And that wasn't a scary thought to him because he knew that if you build infrastructure, you can support that. But he would never in a million years have envisaged having population growth crammed into 3 cities, right? Brisbane, Sydney, and Melbourne. That would have just seemed so insane to him. He wanted to build the Bradfield scheme in North Queensland. You know, if you drive from Ingham down to Townsville, the highway on your right hand side, there's all these they're not very tall, but steeply rising mountains, and on the left hand side is the ocean, and there's not it's just a rather narrow band of land right between them, and that's the highest rainfall area in Australia, right? And it all pours down and goes straight back out to sea. He said, turn some of it around, turn the headwaters around, get it inland, right? You can make massively productive area permanently out there, increase Australia's productivity. These would be wonderful places for people to live, right? That's where the population growth could be, but you've got to build the infrastructure, etc. Globally, Martin, there's some fantastic. There's a picture of the world map, a flat world map, and think about things like, put aside everything you've been told about China and the Belt and Road and whatever. Just put aside the negative thoughts you've been told. Just look at it from a positive thought for once, right? You could have railway lines, high-speed trains, literally connecting the whole world from the bottom of Africa all the way up to the top, with spurs going off, and the Chinese are already building a lot of this, all connecting to the Europe. Europe's already got some really good high-speed rail, but they can always get faster and better. I've been on some pretty good stuff in China, all the way across Eurasia, right? Down into Southeast Asia. The only place that would be the hardest to actually bring the railway to uninterrupted would be Australia, actually. But maybe sometime in the future we can have some fantastic technology that does that too, with sea tunnels or whatever. But right now it's difficult, but you can come pretty much as close as possible, and then use high-speed shipping to connect us. We should have our own network of high-speed rail that can connect to the top of Australia and use high-speed shipping. But the Russians and the Americans are actually in discussion. One of the things that they are regularly negotiating at the moment is a Bering Strait tunnel, because in the Bering Strait between Alaska and Russia, there's two little islands, and you can build a tunnel to the islands and then a tunnel from the islands, and then you can have rail that goes all the way through Alaska, through Canada, all the way down through America, through Mexico, through that little gap, the Darien Gap, right, into South America, all the way down to the bottom, right? And you can connect the world in a good way, right? Physically connect the world, make transportation quicker, trade quicker, more reliable, right? These are the sorts of things that the nations of the world could collaborate on, just like inside them they can collaborate on building infrastructure. And you may not believe me, people may not believe me, but show me the evidence that this is not what China's intention is. There are countries of the world that are thinking about this, that this is what they talk about, right? They're not there plotting how can we win the next war. They're preparing to make sure that if there is a next war, they're not going to lose, because they know there's countries in the world that think about nothing but the world. You could change the dynamic of the whole world, right? If you actually decided, hang on, these are the important things for humanity. These are what we could prioritize. That's how you deliver a future for your kids. That's how you uplift the world. And instead, we're in this rather, while that possibility is there, we've got to navigate this really dangerous period of extreme tension that is being still driven by people that are trying to cling to an outdated system, in my view.
And let me bring that comment from Carne in here, because Carne on Davos, right? Davos. Made the point that there was a very significant disruption going on, and he basically said, well, that order, that old world order that basically existed post the Second World War, the American-led order, I suspect you could probably argue, is really now fragmented and fractured. And he was suggesting that there needs to be an alternative way of looking at that. And in a way, I think he called out very nicely the dilemma that we face if we don't actually wake up and understand that there was a set of assumptions driven out of predominantly the neoliberal and the US and all of those things, that particular way of thinking, the corporate worldview way of thinking. Unless we can break out of that and think differently, we're not going to be able to do some of the visionary stuff that is still potentially feasible. But it requires us to think differently about other countries and the way they operate, and different philosophies that underpin it. And there is a philosophical point here that I think Carney put his finger on. And it was interesting how it was reported. Quite a few people said, well, that actually makes quite a lot of sense. But of course, there was significant pushback, particularly from, let's call it the old world order, shall we?
The most useful thing that Carney said was he talked about the rules-based order. And if you watch the whole clip, he started off with this sort of apocryphal story about the shopkeeper in Poland. Now, the shopkeeper in Poland this is obviously a story that capitalists like telling each other. The shopkeeper in Poland was just a shopkeeper. He wanted to make a living out of his shop, but of course it's Poland under communism, and so to do that he had to get along, and so every day he wasn't a communist, but every day he would put a sign up in his shop, "Long live the revolution," because that sign indicated that he was playing along with the system, right? And then some people say that, like, I think one of the points Carney made was that it was later decided that kind of attitude actually helped the system last longer than otherwise would have, because eventually, there was a reaction in Poland and the system came down, as it all did if you're old enough to remember 1989, right across Europe. And he was using that as an analogy to the rules-based order, because starting about 10 or 15 years ago, not more, the language coming out of the Americans in Europe stopped being the term international law. Obama especially popularized this term, the rules-based order. Our government talks about nothing but the rules-based order. And they don't mean international law. International law is very specific. It's contained in the Charter of the United Nations, which all the member countries of the world, which is pretty much everybody, agreed to. And even if you're an anti-globalist, go read the Charter of the United Nations. There's nothing in there to disagree with. Go read the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. There is nothing in there to disagree with. The Charter of the United Nations is the best assertion of national sovereignty you'll ever read. That's what we all agreed to. Not give up our sovereignty, but we agreed to a framework, because what is law? The legal theorists will tell you that constitutional law in any country is or it's what the American Declaration calls it. Government is ordained by the consent of the governed. Right? We consent to be ruled over. That's the nature of government. Well, international law was the same thing. All the countries said, okay, we will agree to this system because we don't want to repeat the war that just killed 80 million people. Right? And so that was the system. But one of the checks and balances of that, which was not by design, was the Cold War. Right? And the Cold War was like a competition between the two sides, pretty dirty competition, but somewhat of a competition, and it kept a certain transparency and I won't say honesty, because that in no way represents the Cold War, but it was a certain transparency of competition, and people knew what was going on. But when the Cold War ended, there was one superpower left, the Americans. That was it, and they were determined to maintain the sole superpower. And that's what the whole neoconservative movement's about. They will not accept anything that's a challenge to America's status as the sole superpower in the world. And just as it was becoming obvious that was changing because of the rise of China, the Russians, after years of being under the heel saying, we're not going to take this anymore, etc., around the time of Obama, they doubled down. They couldn't cite international law. They cited the rules-based order. This is the rules-based order. You are breaking the rules-based order. And our organization would put out analysis of this, and we nicknamed it the Our Rules-Based Order. And what Carney said is he belled the cat, because here's Carney, probably one of the most connected people ever to be the head of government of any Western country. Mark Carney, former governor of the Bank of Canada, former governor of the Bank of England, big honcho at the Bank for International Settlements, the architect of the said bail-in we were talking about before, right? The Mark Carney, he belled the cat on the rules-based order, and he said it was always false, right? That this was, he didn't use the word hypocritical, but his description was hypocritical, that the rules applied to some and not the others, whoever the Americans and the British decided they applied to, right? The rules would be imposed on some and not on others. I mean, we're looking at a situation. If you just look at this year about how the world is, this regime that's just massively out of control. Look at the way the Chinese intervened in Venezuela in the first few days of 2026, kidnapped the president, killed all his security, and took him back to Beijing. Look at the way the Chinese are threatening to take over Greenland. Martin,
you said Chinese. You said Chinese. I don't think you mean Chinese.
It has to be the Chinese. They're the evil regime. I can't be talking about anyone other than the Chinese, Mark. Look at the way the Chinese right now are starving Cuba to death. because Cuba refuses to give in to them. This tiny little country, they put a total blockade on it, right? Starving it to death. Look at the way the Chinese have just sent 2 aircraft carriers to the Gulf with the threat of bombing Iran to the smithereens if Iran won't. Well, the latest demand in the negotiations with Iran is that Iran has to not just give up its nuclear program, which the Chinese claim they destroyed last year, so it shouldn't exist, but now they're saying they've got to give up the nuclear program or they'll bomb them again. But they're saying they've got to let Chinese oil companies into. I let slip there. They've got to let Chinese oil companies into Iran. Obviously, I hope everyone can see what I'm talking about. That wasn't the Chinese that had done that. This is the Americans just this year. Just this year. This is happening right now in real time. And that's what Mark Carney belled the cat on, right? This is a regime that is going down the toilet. I went to, as I told you when we did our show on my China trip, I went to America for the first time as an 18-year-old. I was so excited to go there. That was the place to go my whole life. That was the pinnacle of the world. Go to America, the most advanced country. I was so excited. Everything about it excited me. Seeing a bloody 7-Eleven excited me. A Wendy's, all the stupid fast food stores excited me, right? This was America. I went there a dozen times in 20 years. My last trip was 2013. I will be happy never to go again. The immense poverty I saw in San Francisco when I was there in 2013, a beautiful city, San Francisco, on the surface. From a zoom out, it looks like a beautiful city, and just poverty everywhere, homelessness everywhere. Half of them were military vets holding out their veteran cards as they were begging. This is a country that their infrastructure is crumbling, right? They don't have a centimeter of high-speed rail either. Right? They've got the richest people in the world who are now trillionaires, not just billionaires, they're trillionaires. They've all turned up in these Epstein files for some reason. We haven't even talked about that. This is just a country that's circling the toilet, and they want us to hate the country that hasn't focused on any of those wars, hasn't been involved in any of that, is not going around threatening countries. And don't give me this shit about the South China Sea and the Indian border and whatever. All of any disputes that China has is right on its bloody borders, because it's not going around looking for them. These are long-standing things. But they in no way compares to us and the Americans going to the other side of the world and blowing the ever-loving shit out of them, like we've done in Libya and like we did in Iraq and like we've done in Syria, and like we want to do in Iran again, right? There's no comparison whatsoever. So don't give me that shit just because you hate China so much. You refuse to look at the fact that this is a country that's not doing those things. It's getting on with just building its future, and we have been conditioned to hate it and fear it and despise it because by people who don't want us to look at the fact that we're being ripped off by trillionaires. America has spent so much. You raised the AI bubble, Martin. One of the things that I don't want to keep making everything a comparison to China, but China has what they call dark factories, entirely robotic, zero lights, because it's robots. They don't need to put lights in, and it's all done, and it's all controlled by the most sophisticated, practically applied AI, right? That gets better every time it uses it. That's what it uses its AI for. America uses its AI so that Elon Musk can have programs that make women take their clothes off. And that's why America needs all these damn servers, data centers. It is projected to spend something like $700 billion by next year on data centers, $700 billion, whereas China, which is kicking its bloody ass, will only have spent about $80 billion on data centers. Because it's not using AI to just be bloody idiots. It's using it for a practical application, and it's making sure it pays for itself. Whereas America is just this AI bubble, and just like every other bubble, especially to do with the internet, since the internet burst on the scenes, right? The new trend comes along. All these funds come up. They borrow all the money in the world. They chuck it at it. Doesn't matter the consequences. Just throw it at it. Right? Take everyone's electricity, take everyone's water. That's the new thing. We're going to build AI. We're going to build data centers, and then it'll come crumbling down, right? And they tell us that's a successful economy. And they want us to be afraid of the country that is clearly a successful economy. So don't be afraid of that country. Understand what Mark Carney actually admitted about the rules-based order, right? Because it was always bullshit. It was always hypocritical. I told you this on your show years ago when Trump was first elected, because this thing leaked out. His first Secretary of State was this guy Rex Tillerson from Exxon, and you can go and look it online. It's called the Tillerson memo. The State Department wrote him a memo and said, we use human rights against our adversaries, not our allies. And so here's America allied with countries like Saudi Arabia, right? If you want to carry on about human rights, some of the worst human rights abuses in the world, never speak a word. China, they're committing genocide, blah blah blah. And this memo just spelled it out. It was all fake. It was all for games, right? Just so they could whip people up, and people fell for it. Mark Carney has belled the cat on that. And that's what people should learn from. Here's the Prime Minister of Canada saying, yeah, we knew it was fake. And now, because Trump is so much out of control, and, it's totally unpredictable, and it's just people just lurching from one, brain fart to the next with Trump, right? They're saying, well, what do we do? Well, what we do is stop thinking about, you got to give up your system. You got to take away the power from these corporates. Don't destroy the corporations, but you take away their power, right? That's fundamental. You've got to do that. You can't have multinationals ruling the world like we have. Take away their power, give nation states back the power, right? Because they're the ones that are accountable to their people, not the corporations. And don't try and protect that system. And if Mark Carney's only prepared to go halfway because he still wants to stick with the Bank for International Settlements dictated system, well, that's not good enough, because once he's let the cat out of the bag, then I think it's going to unravel quite fast. But then the countries of the world say, okay, what works, right? What do we need? We need infrastructure. We need investment. Let's work with the countries that do that.
Well, that takes us nicely then to just two things, I think. Firstly, let's just look a little bit at the policies that you're proposing. The National Bank is a critical cornerstone of it, right? Because that's about investing in the infrastructure that's required. There's also some other very important stuff there about the way that the banking system works and supports the broader economy. And all of those things that become quite important planks then, don't they, of an alternative way of thinking?
Yeah, it's very fundamental. Look, if you just think of it like this, when it comes to the economy, the physical economy can only work if you have a financial system to serve it with emphasis on the serve. Years ago, I know there's debates about this. David Graeber and those guys have you would be familiar with this kind of stuff, Martin. They said we never really were a barter society. But let's just go with, for argument's sake, the transition from barter to where we are through different use of currencies and whatever. So even barter was a form of financial system, but it was the most inefficient, right? And so we obviously quickly moved off that. But once banking came along, banking was this incredibly powerful thing. And Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury of the Secretary, wrote these really brilliant papers about how what banking does, what credit does, is uses the future to, create possibilities in the present that create the future, right? You can read it in his report on manufacturers, etc. And banking is a very, very powerful thing. And it comes down to who controls it. If you believe in the neoliberal ideology, you would say banking has to be entirely private and run purely for profit. And they'll give you a sanitized explanation for why, because I'll say that's the only way to work efficiently, right? People pursuing profit. But that's just a sanitized cover story. It's so that private vested interests can make all the money out of it, right? They get all the benefit. That's all it ever was. And what Alexander Hamilton started, and then it led to a movement that influenced the Australian Labor Party with King O'Malley, etc., that started our national bank, the Commonwealth Bank, was saying, no, it cannot be exclusively private. The government must have its own bank. The power of banking must be in the hands of the government. And the communists said, all banking must be in the hands of the government. Well, that's not. I mean, that's communist ideology. That's not absolutely necessary. The Chinese became successful when they moved away from that, but they didn't move to all private banking. They moved to a mix, right? Big state banks, but a lot of small private banks. That's what's driven their economic growth. We used to have state banks mixed with our private banks. We got rid of them all, and so the private banks will make investments and loans based on maximizing their profits in the short term. The public bank can use the same power of banking, but make investments and loans based on benefiting the economy for the long term. Lending for infrastructure, lending to governments for infrastructure, lending to business, to entrepreneurs for industry, lending to small business, right? Lending to first home buyers. Make sure make sure those young people that are coming in, you're not just, don't think of it as consumers coming to the market. Those young people are the next generation. How perverse is it we talk about all the perverse incentives and disincentives in society, like the fact that we pay bankers more than nurses and teachers, right? That sort of thing, right? Well, how perverse is it that the people in society with the heaviest debt burden have that burden at the same time as they're raising the next generation? That is our system, right? And it shouldn't be, right? The Commonwealth Bank used to be mandated under the Commonwealth Bank Act to provide loans to first home buyers at the lowest interest rate achievable. And that was they had that program and they made sure it worked. So that's why this banking policy is so important. And from that policy, then you have the mechanism to start doing the other things to make Australia a productive economy again.
Absolutely. And that is the point. There is genuine opportunity, but only if things actually are tweaked and pushed in a different direction, because just repeating the last 30 years again is going to end up with an even greater gap between the big corporate profits and the rest of society, and the divisions that we're already seeing bubbling up will get more and more severe. So it's a critical thing for societal reasons as well as economic reasons. But there's one more thing I just wanted to touch on before we end. You touched on it right at the top of the show, and that is the bill that went through the lower house in 24 hours, right? I think we should come back to that, because there is a very, very important point here about to what extent can we debate these issues and discuss these issues? To what extent can we actually ask questions of those in power at the moment? And everything that I'm seeing suggests that, in fact, our ability to do that is being watered down and watered down. I discussed, I think, on a previous show with you about, these bricks and blocks are being put in place so that the police state more and more determines what we think and how we think and what we can say and what we can't say. And this is a really important point, because if you actually believe that there is a better way of thinking about the future, it's really important to be able to discuss and explore these ideas.
Well, exactly. So anything that impinges on free speech, you need to be very, very leery of. And unfortunately, in Australia, we've just shredded free speech entirely. Now, that bill in January, that was 24 hours, was extraordinary from beginning to end. There had been a previous bill that they'd given a week to look at, but that's the bill where the actual the measures mostly connected to free speech were thrown out, and some of that was thanks to One Nation first said no, we're not going to vote for it, and then the Greens and the Coalition, and bang, it didn't happen. Now, partly One Nation's position was influenced by Jared Rennick, I believe, because Jared Rennick had been very critical of One Nation being a bit soft on that a year earlier, right? And so One Nation didn't want that criticism again. But nevertheless, so they stopped that, but they pushed through this bill that says you can ban hate groups, and it's retrospective. The groups don't have to have committed a crime, and it relates to the criteria relates to still speech, right? So, and then the only safeguard is that ASIO has to recommend it. But then that's assuming ASIO is a safeguard, and in fact, ASIO is not, because as you and I talked about on the last time we did a show, now the Albanese government's pushing through a bill to give ASIO permanent police state powers, and Four Corners covered ASIO's failings in intelligence that in relation to Bondi Monday last week, and ASIO preempted that story with actually a threat. They threatened Four Corners, the ABC, publicly with going with that story. But the ABC had a pretty good source for their story, and it answered questions that I'd been raising as soon as Bondi happened, right? ASIO has enormous powers that it was given, that we were told it was giving it precisely to stop terrorist attacks. Now, if the perpetrator wasn't known to ASIO, I wouldn't have been as critical, but the perpetrator was known to ASIO. They knew the perpetrator. They got enormous powers that we were told in 2003. These powers are necessary for an imminent terrorist attack, right? ASIO has to be able to get this information. We gave them these powers. We put a sunset clause on them. Anthony Albanese gave a speech in 2003 attacking these powers and likening them to Nazi Germany back in 2003. But now, all this time later, it's Anthony Albanese that's pushing a bill that's going to give ASIO more powers for interrogation, far beyond just terrorist threats. He's not holding them accountable for the failures that led to Bondi, and he's taking away the sunset clause to make them permanent. And this is a permanent police state regime that we're going to be legislating in this country. And it's absolutely shocking. People go to the Citizens Party YouTube page. We've just put up a video, a short 5-minute video that explains it. There's a petition there people can sign. This will be debated in March in Parliament. Now, we need people to actually email and phone members of Parliament about this, senators especially, and say, don't vote for this. Right? There needs to be a much bigger debate than this. We need to put it in the same category, in the terms of the public mind, of this shocking bill back in January, because we've gone down a path that we're not going to come back from, right? And people will accept these infringements on our rights because we'll be told, oh, those are hate groups, or those are terrorists, or whatever, right? But the laws are written in such a way that they can be used arbitrarily. Anne Toomey, who's not inclined to hyperbole, the constitutional expert, Anne Toomey, pointed out that the hate groups law could be used by a future government to ban the opposition political party. Right? All they have to do is pick who the head of ASIO is, get that guy to make the recommendation, right? And bang, the organization's banned. You shouldn't have those laws on the books. They should not exist, right? Because, and in all, one of the things that's a real giveaway is in all these legislation, one of the things they keep inserting there is what in their definitions is also speech that relates to what they call undermining the economy, Martin. This whole conversation tonight could be interpreted as undermining the economy, right? And that's why you don't allow these, and you've got to fight them when there's a chance to fight them. So that bill's there right now. Go to the Citizens Party's page and have a look at the 5-minute video, right? And it's on Twitter and all our social media. But that explains it, and get involved in this.
Thank you, Robbie.
And then, Martin, just quickly before you go, there's one other thing. There's an email circulating around that we just put out just before this to help promote the show as well. But the other thing we're doing right now is Malcolm Roberts has put up this disallowance motion against the cash acceptance mandate regulations. And the problem is those regulations are worse than having no mandate at all. They will hasten the demise of cash in the name of saving it.
Yep.
That will be voted on in March as well. And we do need people to be hammering coalition senators about that disallowance motion, because this is about properly saving cash by forcing them back to the drawing board. Now, we have no confidence that the government left to its own devices is going to do anything, because back in October at Senate estimates, the One Nation Senator from WA, Tyron Whitten, we wrote questions for him to the Treasury, and he asked Treasury, have you considered the recommendation of the Senate inquiry into branch closures about a government bank? And Treasury's response, Martin, was that, we summarised those recommendations for the government. And so Whitten asked on notice, can I get a copy of the summary? So they provided him a copy of the summary, and it was pathetic. It's just a blank piece of paper with 1 to 8, the recommendations written out. No analysis, no context, no background, no description of the inquiry, no nothing. Just purely going through the motions. Dale Webster said a high school student on work experience could have done it. And this is the Treasury that you pay. These people are on hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to give the government proper advice on policy. And that inquiry was one of the best things Parliament's ever done. Probably cost $500,000, went for 15 months, 13 public hearings, 650 submissions, bipartisan. All the senators on it agreed with the recommendations. They're good recommendations. This was Parliament at its best, examining an issue and coming up with strong conclusions that would have led the headline. The most important recommendation was a guarantee, what do you call it? Declaring cash and banking essential services, right? And the second recommendation was investigate a public bank. Now, excellent recommendations, and it's 18 months and the government's just ignored it. And Treasury, it's their job to assess policy, just gone through worse than going through the motions, right? So you got to light. No wonder the public have just got sick of them. Got a lot of fire under their butts, and that's one way people can actually intervene on this as well. So look at the video on our website about on our YouTube channel about ASIO, and look at our website for this email alert we put out today about this. And please send emails and make phone calls on that as well.
Thank you, Robbie. Well, I've put links and things below in the comments, so check those out. And the summary of all of this is that there are policy settings that could be significantly more beneficial to ordinary Australians than the one we've got. But because of the way that the politics works and because of the way that the corporate sector is linked with that, it's a little complicated. But nevertheless, that doesn't mean we shouldn't continue to push. And those two specific issues, the one relating to the police state and the one relating to the use of cash, are very important immediate issues where we can still make a difference. And Robbie, I want to say thank you for sharing that tonight. And we'll have you back on, I'm sure, down the track. And for as long as we can, we'll keep discussing these important issues because it's about the future of Australia, isn't it?
Sure is. And if you're not involved in pushing for it, or the Greeks come up with the word idiot or idios for people who didn't get involved in politics because they said you're condemning yourself to be ruled by inferior men. So it's you live in this world anyway. You may as well do your best to help shape it rather than it being shaped for you.
Spot on. As Carney said, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, right? I thought that was a very good summary. And we want to be at the table helping to direct and shape the future rather than just being chewed over by those in charge. Robbie, thank you so much. I'm going to take you offline now. I'm going to close the show.
Thanks,
Take care.
man.
See ya.
Thanks, listeners.
So there you go. Thank you for that, Robbie, and for all the comments in the chat there. Jason, thank you very much for the super chat. Really appreciated that. Helps us to cover the costs as always. Just to say that next week I'm going to have Leith back on. We're going to talk about the latest economic stuff, specifically, of course, post the RBA change of trajectory. The minutes came out today, and they're talking quite hawkishly about more rate rises. What are the implications of that, and how does that play into the economic agenda? So join me for that. The doggies are still here. Yep. So they are ready for the next part of the day now. So that'll be my next agenda. But thank you for spending some time with us this evening. Really appreciate it. Please like, share, and subscribe. Check out my recorded shows each day of the week. And I'll be back next Tuesday for my next live show. Take care. Have a good evening.